I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Senator John Thune knocked the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 on the Senate floor Tuesday. The South Dakota Republican labeled the legislation as, quote, a bad deal for the American people. The Inflation Reduction Act is a slimmed-down version of the Build Back Better bill and is a large investment in making healthcare and prescription drugs more affordable, fighting climate change, and taxing wealthy corporations. President Biden and Democratic lawmakers have touted the legislation as a solution to combat 40-year high inflation. Republican lawmakers have argued that the act won't actually help bring down prices.
We are.
I would ask unanimous consent the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Madam President, Democrats dropped the latest version of their tax and spending spree last week. And like every previous version, this bill is a bad deal for the American people. So where should I start, Madam President? Well, maybe with the bill's title. In true Orwellian style, Democrats are calling the bill the Inflation Reduction Act, even though the bill would do nothing to reduce inflation. And you don't have to take my word for it. The nonpartisan Penn-Wharton budget model analyzed the bill and found that the bill would not reduce inflation. In fact, the analysis found that Democrats' bill would contribute to inflation through 2024 and have no material impact on inflation in the long term. Madam President, inflation has hit working Americans hard. Their grocery bills have ballooned. Rents have skyrocketed. Filling up their cars costs 75% more per gallon than it did when the president took office. Their utility bills have increased. And the list goes on. Families are having to cut back on purchases and dig into their savings or pull out their credit cards, or in some cases, visit a food bank to make ends meet. And what does Democrats' tax and spending spree do to help? Nothing. Americans are dealing with the worst inflation in more than 40 years, and Democrats' bill does nothing to help end our current crisis. So what does the bill do, Madam President? Well, for one thing, it raises taxes. That's right. Our economy has shrunk for each of the past 2 quarters. In fact, by any common definition, we are now in a recession, and the Democrats' bill raises taxes by hundreds of billions of dollars. Here's what the Democrat leader previously had to say about raising taxes in a recession. I quote, "If we're in a recession and we're in a difficult economic time, I don't think Senator Obama or anyone else is going to raise any taxes. You don't want to take money out of the economy when the economy is shrinking," end quote. That's something that Democrat leader has previously said. President Obama himself expressed a similar sentiment when he said, and I quote, "The last thing you want to do is to raise taxes in the middle of a recession," end quote. The last thing. Well, Madam President, I should say, apparently that doesn't apply when Democrats have Green New Deal projects they want to pay for. Democrats' bill attempts to offset the cost of the Green New Deal spending spree by raising taxes on American businesses, particularly manufacturers. The proposed book minimum tax would be a $313 billion tax hike, with roughly half of that increase falling on American manufacturers. Madam President, I don't think I need to tell anyone the likely outcome of raising taxes on businesses, particularly when the economy is contracting. The likely outcome is less growth, lower wages, and fewer jobs. According to an analysis from the National Association of Manufacturers, in 2023 alone, the bill would reduce real gross domestic product by more than $68 billion and result in 218,108 fewer workers in the overall economy. 218,000 fewer workers in 2023 alone, that according to the National Association of Manufacturers, if the Democrats' bill passes. The Democrats' bill also raises taxes on the energy sector, specifically on domestic oil and gas production. It's another facepalm move from Democrats. Currently, gas prices are 75% higher than they were when President Biden took office. Electricity prices are up. The cost of utility gas service is way up. And yet Democrats think it's a good idea to raise taxes on domestic oil and gas production. Apparently, Democrats want our current high energy prices to stick around for the long term. So what are Democrats going to use all that tax hike money for? Well, for one thing, they're going to use it to fund Green New Deal projects. Critical priorities like monitoring gaps in tree canopy coverage and road equity, and funding for the post office's purchase of electric delivery vehicles. And then there are the multiple slush funds for Green New Deal projects and the tax credit for the purchase of a new electric car or truck. Of course, you'll only be able to use the credit if you can afford to spend somewhere in the neighborhood of $60,000, which is the average price for a new electric vehicle, while we're in the middle of a recession. So it would almost undoubtedly be most Americans with higher salaries, and according to the bill, up to $300,000 per household, who would be able to make use of this credit. So a tax credit to buy electric vehicles for rich people. But I guess Democrats think electric vehicle tax credits for wealthier Americans are a good use of taxpayer dollars. What else is in here, Madam President? I mentioned the bill's tax hikes, but the Democrats' bill also attempts to raise revenue by increasing IRS audits and enforcement. That's right. The Democrats' bill would more than double the current number of IRS employees, making the agency nearly 3 times larger than the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, the agency, I might add, that's charged with security at all of our nation's borders, and more than 50% larger, this is the IRS under the Democrats' plan, more than 50% larger than the entire U.S. Department of Agriculture. Democrats give the IRS a whopping $80 billion in additional funding over the next 10 years. Of that $80 billion, 57% goes to enforcement, 4% goes to taxpayer services. Yeah, that's right, 4%. So, Madam President, this is an agency that only succeeded in answering about 1 out of every 50 phone calls during the 2021 tax season. And yet 4% of the $80 billion is going to taxpayer services. 57% goes to enforcement so that the IRS can spend more time harassing taxpayers around this country. Madam President, Democrats are focused not on proving the IRS's responsiveness to taxpayers, but on boosting the number of IRS audits. I still haven't mentioned the bill's socialist-style price controls for prescription drugs, price controls that would result in fewer new drugs and treatments. A study from last November found that Democrats' price control plans would result in 135 fewer new drugs through 2039. That's a lot of potentially life-changing and life-saving treatments to lose. And then, of course, there's Democrats' plan to expand Obamacare subsidies to higher-earning Americans, a move which would drive up the cost of health insurance. Well, I could go on. Madam President, most Americans remember the lead-up to Democrats' American Rescue Plan spending spree last March. They were promised at the time that passing that bill would have big benefits for our economy and for American families. Well, we know what actually happened. Democrats' reckless spending spree helped trigger the worst inflation in 4 decades, and American families have suffered as a result. Now we're being asked to swallow a similar story about the Democrats' latest spending legislation. This bill will help our economy, we're told, even though we know it would make life harder for American businesses and workers at a time when the economy is already contracting. And make no mistake about that, second consecutive quarter where we've had negative economic growth, negative GDP growth in our economy. It will help inflation, Democrats claim, even though a nonpartisan analysis said it would do nothing to help alleviate our current crisis. It will reduce our deficit, Democrats say, relying on some very shady accounting measures to reach their supposed deficit reduction number. It will help lower energy prices, the president claims, even though new energy taxes would further inflate near-term energy bills during a season of already historic prices. Well, Madam President, you would think Democrats might have been chastened by their disastrous American Rescue Plan spending spree, but you would be wrong. Apparently, Democrats are determined to get in another disastrous spending bill. And once again, it will be the American people that will be left to suffer the consequences. Madam President, I yield the floor.